Did you know that the most reliable protection against the deadly cold of the Great Plains was always literally under people's feet? Settlers who came to the vast expanses of the Wild West faced a reality for which it was impossible to prepare in advance. There were no forests for building walls, no coal for heating, and the wind blew so hard it could knock a person off their feet. In these conditions, the only way to survive was to use an ancient engineering trick that turned the earth itself into a giant heat accumulator. They learned to build houses that did not require a single nail, but kept the temperature inside 30 degrees higher than outside. Watch the video to the end to find out exactly how this primitive but ingenious thermoregulation technology worked, saving thousands of lives before the advent of central heating.
But we're safe in here.
What if I told you that the first glimpse of the promised land did not fill people with joy, but with real panic and horror? Settlers who left behind the wooded states of the East or the green hills of Europe found themselves in the middle of an ocean of grass where the horizon was visible for dozens of miles in all directions. There was not a single tree to build even a temporary shelter, nor a single stone to lay the foundation for a hearth. The psychological pressure of this endless emptiness was enormous, causing many to turn their wagons around and return to civilization in the first few days. Those who decided to stay understood that the familiar laws of architecture and construction simply did not work here. They had to forget everything their fathers had taught them and come up with a new way to build shelter from the only material available. That material was the soil itself, dense and intertwined with the roots of tough steppe grass that had not been plowed for centuries. People quickly realized that trying to find a substitute for the familiar wood was doomed to failure and turned their eyes downward. The solution came not from a good life, but from desperation in the need to survive the first night in the open wind. They began to dig the ground as ancient tribes had done, but brought their own tools and understanding of comfort to the process. It was not just an act of construction, but an attempt to hide from a hostile, overly open space. The first shelters, called dugouts, were simply holes dug into the slopes of hills or ravines. People literally buried themselves in the landscape, trying to become part of it and stop resisting the wind. The frontier demanded humility, and the dugout became the ideal architectural embodiment of this forced humility before nature. By digging into the slope, the settler immediately got 3 ready-made walls that did not need to be erected, insulated, or protected from rain. All that remained was to close the facade and come up with something that could serve as a roof over their heads. This approach solved the main problem of the lack of building materials, but created many new and unexpected difficulties. Life in a burrow was radically different from life in a wooden house, requiring a complete restructuring of daily life and habits. It was always dimly lit, the air was heavy and damp, and the walls could crumble under their own weight at any moment. But it was this primitive step that allowed people to settle in areas that were considered uninhabitable. Without dugouts, the development of the Great Plains could have been delayed for another half-century or not happened at all. The dugout became a symbol of perseverance and willingness to sacrifice comfort for the sake of owning one's own land. It was a temporary solution that lasted for many years and even decades for many families. In these dark, damp rooms, children were born and raised who had never seen a wooden floor. The history of the frontier is not only the history of cowboys and shootouts, but also the history of people living inside hills. It is strange to realize that the great American dream began in a dark, damp pit dug by hand on the slope of a ravine. This contradicts all the beautiful images of white houses and neat fences that we see in movies. The reality was dirty, dark, and smelled of damp earth, but it was real. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Could you live in such conditions for several years in order to get free land? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Want to know the secret that allowed people to survive in -40 degrees without powerful stoves and modern heaters? The trick was to use the thermal inertia of the soil, a physical phenomenon that the settlers may not have known about in theory, but felt very well in practice. Just a few feet below the surface, the temperature of the Earth remains virtually unchanged throughout the year, regardless of the weather above. It acts as a giant natural buffer, smoothing out extreme peaks of heat and cold. When blizzards raged on the surface and temperatures dropped to critical levels, the Earth gave off the heat it had accumulated over the summer. This principle made the dugout a unique structure with its own microclimate that could not be replicated in an above-ground frame house. While the wooden walls froze through in a matter of hours, the thickness of the earth held out for weeks. The stable soil temperature in this region was approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This meant that even without heating, it was never truly freezing inside a dugout, posing no threat to life. A small heat source was sufficient to bring the temperature to an acceptable level of comfort. In winter, the earth acted as a blanket, and in summer it became a natural air conditioner, providing relief from the exhausting heat. When the sun scorched the grass outside and the air heated up to 100 degrees, the dugout remained pleasantly cool. People would go down into their homes to catch their breath and hide from the scorching rays, from which there was no escape on the open plain. This temperature difference sometimes reached as much as 30 to 40 degrees, creating a shocking contrast upon entering. The walls of the dugout had enormous heat capacity, slowly accumulating and slowly releasing energy. This prevented the sharp temperature fluctuations inside the room that were characteristic of light wooden structures. Even if the fire in the hearth went out in the morning, the house did not cool down instantly, retaining residual heat. This was critically important in conditions of fuel shortage, when every piece of dried manure or rare log was worth its weight in gold. The settlers quickly learned to use the terrain to maximize this heat-saving effect. They tried to dig dugouts on the southern slopes of the hills so that the facade would receive maximum sunlight in winter. This added passive solar heating to the geothermal heat of the earth, creating a surprisingly effective system. The north side was completely sheltered by the hill, protecting the house from the coldest and most penetrating winds. However, this system only worked perfectly with proper waterproofing and ventilation, which was difficult to achieve with primitive means. Moisture from the ground constantly sought to penetrate inside, making the air heavy and promoting the growth of mold. The fight against dampness was the flip side of free geothermal heating. People were forced to constantly heat their homes, not even for warmth, but for dryness. The thickness of the earth layer above the roof also acted as an additional insulator, trapping precious heat inside. The deeper the house, the more stable the temperature, but the less light and air got inside. It was necessary to find a balance between thermal efficiency and the basic ability to breathe. Engineering decisions were made intuitively, by trial and error, often at the expense of one's own health. Interestingly, this ancient technology is becoming popular again today in green building under new names. Modern architects admire the energy efficiency of the dugout houses that illiterate farmers built a century and a half ago. The principles of physics have not changed, only the materials and tools have changed. As a result, the dugout was not just a hole, but a complex thermodynamic device that used the planet's energy for human survival. It was a union with nature, formed not out of love for the environment, but for the sake of preserving life. How comfortable do you think a temperature of 12-15 degrees Celsius was for a family to live in permanently? But even with such unique heating, there was one huge problem that could ruin everything. In the next chapter, you will learn what these houses were built from and why this material was called Nebraska marble. Guess how long it took to cut enough earth to build one house? The building block of the frontier was sod, the top layer of soil densely interwoven with the tough roots of prairie grass. This grass had been growing here for thousands of years, creating an incredibly dense and elastic carpet that was impossible to tear apart with your hands. It was the root system that made the soil suitable for construction, acting as reinforcement in concrete. Settlers jokingly and sometimes proudly called this rough material Nebraska marble. Extracting this material was backbreaking work, requiring a special plow and enormous physical strength. The plow, called a grasshopper, cut long strips of sod about half a meter wide and several inches thick. The sound of the roots breaking was like the crackling of thick fabric tearing and could be heard hundreds of meters away. After the strips were cut, they were chopped with shovels into separate bricks of a convenient size. Each brick weighed about 50 pounds and thousands were needed to build even a small house. Men, women, and even teenagers worked from dawn to dusk, hauling tons of earth to the construction site. It was a race against time, as the cut sod had to be laid before it dried out and began to crumble. Fresh sod was moist and pliable, allowing the blocks to be fitted tightly together. Laying turf walls was similar to bricklaying, but had its own unique features and tricks. The bricks were laid with the grass facing down so that the roots would eventually grow into the bottom row and hold the structure firmly in place. The walls were made very thick, often in 2 or 3 rows, to provide the necessary stability and insulation. Such thickness turned the house into a real fortress, capable of withstanding bullets and arrows. Special attention was paid to binding the joints and filling the gaps with loose earth to prevent drafts. The walls grew slowly, row by row, rising above the endless plain as a gray rectangle. Windows and doors were the most difficult elements as they required scarce wood to create frames. Often, only one window and one door were used so as not to weaken the structure. Turf walls had the amazing ability to repair themselves after minor damage and rain. Over time, the grass on the outside could start growing again, turning the house into a green hill. This provided excellent camouflage, making the dwelling virtually invisible against the landscape from a distance. But this same property attracted all the wildlife that inhabited the prairie to the walls of the house. The main enemy of such walls was water, which could wash away the structure during prolonged rains. Therefore, the roof had to have a sufficient overhang to divert water away from the base of the walls. If water washed away the lower rows, the house could suddenly settle or even collapse on its inhabitants. Constant repairs and plastering the walls with mud were a never-ending routine for every owner of a sod house. Inside, the walls were often leveled by cutting off protruding roots with a sharp knife or shovel. This gave the room a neater and more livable appearance, although the earth remained earth. Some wealthier owners tried to plaster the walls with a mixture of clay and ash. But even without finishing, these rough, dark walls provided a sense of security. Nebraska marble was free, lay right underfoot, and did not require delivery by railroad. It was the quintessence of affordability and utility, allowing the poor to become homeowners. The paradox was that people built houses from the same soil they had come to cultivate. This construction was a feat of endurance that is rarely written about in history books. Thousands of tons of turned earth, hands rubbed raw, and backs broken. Such was the price of the first home. Don't forget to like this if you are impressed by the labor intensity of this process. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what was the most dangerous element of such a house? While the walls could be made of turf, the roof was a real engineering puzzle in the absence of wood. It was necessary to cover a span several meters wide with only shrubs and earth at hand. The roof was the heaviest, most complex, and most unreliable element of the entire structure. A mistake in calculations or savings on materials could result in the sleeping family simply being crushed at night. The roof was usually based on a single valuable beam, which was carried hundreds of miles or obtained from rare groves near rivers. This central beam, the ridge beam, bore the enormous load of the entire roof. If it cracked or bent, the fate of the house was sealed. Thinner poles, often made from willow or poplar trunks, were laid from this beam to the walls. A layer of branches, brushwood, and stiff-stepped grass was laid on top of the poles, creating a dense cushion. This layer was supposed to keep the earth from falling into the room. Everything that could be found was used: reeds, corn stalks, and even old fabrics. This was a kind of waterproofing and a base for the final, heaviest layer. The same turf bricks were laid on top of the branches, often in 2 layers, with the grass facing up. The weight of such a roof was enormous, reaching several tons per small area. The walls had to be wide and strong enough to withstand this crushing weight. Rain made the structure even heavier, saturating the ground with water and increasing the load to critical levels. Due to the enormous weight, the roof sagged, and a support pole often had to be placed in the center of the room. This pole hindered movement but guaranteed the safety of the dugout's inhabitants. All life was organized around it, and it became the center of the sparse interior. People constantly glanced at the ceiling, watching for new cracks or sagging. The waterproofing of such a roof was, to put it mildly, conditional and rarely saved them from prolonged rains. The settlers joked bitterly that if it rained outside for 2 days, it would continue inside for another 3 days. Water seeped through the turf, dripping dirty slush onto furniture, beds, and food. Women were forced to hold umbrellas over the stove or stretch tarpaulins to cook dinner. The constant dampness from above caused the wooden elements of the frame to rot faster than usual. Replacing a rotten beam in a finished house was a complex operation, comparable to a major renovation. Half of the roof had to be dismantled, again moving tons of earth by hand. The fear of collapse was a constant companion in life in a turf house. In addition, such a living roof became an excellent habitat for local flora and fauna. In the spring, flowers bloomed on the roof, turning the house into a flowering flower bed, which looked surreal. The roots of the plants continued to grow, penetrating through the layer of branches and hanging from the ceiling inside the house. This created the feeling that nature was slowly engulfing human habitation. The roof was not just protection from the weather. It was a constant source of dirt and dust. Small particles of earth fell from the ceiling constantly, covering everything with a thin layer of gray coating. It was impossible to achieve perfect cleanliness when tons of soil hung overhead. It was a primitive, dangerous, but only possible solution in those conditions. People risked their lives every night just by going to sleep under tons of earth held up by thin branches. Could you fall asleep knowing that several tons of wet earth were hanging above you? But weight and water weren't the only problems. In the next chapter, you'll learn why the air in these houses was just as much of a challenge as the roof itself. Entering a dugout from bright sunlight, a person seemed to enter another world, devoid of color and space. The first thing that struck the nose was the specific, incomparable smell of damp earth, stale smoke, and an unventilated room. This smell permeated clothing, hair, and skin, becoming the hallmark of the frontier's inhabitants. Ventilation in such houses was practically non-existent, as the windows were small and often did not open in order to conserve heat. The air inside was always stuffy, heavy, and humid, reminiscent of a cellar or vegetable storage room. Smoke from the hearth or stove often did not escape completely into the chimney, but lingered under the ceiling, stinging the eyes. People lived in constant oxygen deprivation, which caused headaches and chronic fatigue. Opening the door in winter to ventilate meant letting out the precious heat that had been so hard to accumulate. There was a catastrophic lack of light in the dugout, even on the sunniest days of summer. Tiny windows, often covered with oiled paper instead of expensive glass, let in only dim, scattered light. The corners of the room were always plunged into thick shadow, creating an oppressive feeling of confinement. Life took place in semi-darkness, which greatly affected people's eyesight and mental state. Animal fat candles or simple oil lamps were used for lighting, which smoked and added soot to the air. The faint light barely dispelled the darkness, creating dancing shadows on the uneven earthen walls. Reading or doing needlework was only possible in close proximity to a light source. Darkness was a constant backdrop to everyday life, forcing people to go to bed at sunset. The unfinished walls absorbed what little light penetrated inside. The black or dark gray color of the earth weighed on the psyche, creating the feeling of being in a tomb. Women who spent most of their time indoors suffered particularly from this gloomy environment. Depression, known as step madness, often began with the oppressive darkness of the dugout. Dust was an omnipresent substance that could not be removed by cleaning. It hung in the air, creaked on the teeth during meals, and settled in the lungs. The dry climate of the plains and the earthen walls created ideal conditions for the constant formation of fine dust. People breathed dust, slept in dust, and ate dust every day. Soundproofing, on the other hand, was one of the few advantages of this type of construction. The thick walls completely muffled the sounds of the outside world, creating absolute ringing silence inside. When the wind howled outside, only the breathing of sleeping people or the crackling of the fire could be heard inside. But this silence was sometimes as frightening as the noise of a storm, reinforcing the feeling of isolation from the world. In such conditions, it was difficult to maintain personal hygiene and clean clothes. Water had to be carried from far away and was used sparingly, so washing clothes and bathing were rare events. The damp, stagnant air contributed to the growth of bacteria and mold on belongings. Clothes quickly became damp and acquired a musty smell that was impossible to get rid of. Space was extremely limited, and one room had to serve as a kitchen, bedroom, living room, and workshop. The cramped conditions forced the family to be in constant physical contact, which led to conflicts. Personal space did not exist as a concept. There was simply nowhere to be alone. It was a life on the edge of the body's physiological capabilities, in a constant struggle for a breath of fresh air and a ray of light. The dugout protected them from the cold, but slowly undermined the health of its inhabitants from within. It was a high price to pay for the opportunity to have a roof over their heads. What if I told you that these primitive burrows were safer than modern houses during disasters? The Great Plains were famous for their unpredictable and harsh climate, which could destroy all life in a matter of hours. Tornadoes that swept away everything in their path were a common occurrence in these parts. But when a tornado hit a settlement, the light frame houses were blown to smithereens, while the dugouts remained intact. A house dug into the ground was impossible to blow away. It had no sail area for the wind to catch. Almost every settler had heard stories of families who managed to descend into such shelters seconds before the roof above them disappeared in a whirlwind. There were no weak spots in the ground that could succumb to the impact, because the soil itself served as the strongest protection. Many even reinforced their entrances with heavy doors to prevent the wind from tearing them off, and this simple technique saved lives. People knew that if they managed to dive underground, the hurricane would bypass them, as if their house had ceased to exist for the elements. During terrible snowstorms, which could last for several days, the dugout became a real ark of salvation. Snow could completely cover the house, so that even the chimney was not visible, but inside it remained warm. The thick walls did not freeze, and the family could wait out the bad weather in relative safety with a supply of food and fuel. The main task was to regularly dig out the door and chimney so as not to suffocate. In harsh winters, the dugout's ability to retain heat literally saved people's lives. Sometimes the temperature dropped so low that water froze even inside wooden houses, and people were forced to heat their stoves almost around the clock. But in dugouts, heat was needed much less often because the earth cooled slowly and retained the accumulated heat for a long time. Even when the wind howled so loudly that it seemed as if the steppe was trying to tear the skin off your face, you could sleep peacefully underground. The silence and stillness gave the impression that the storm was somewhere far away. Hailstones on the plains reached the size of chicken eggs and could pierce wooden roofs and kill livestock. Thanks to its thickness and elasticity, the turf roof easily absorbed the blows of the ice chunks. The noise was terrifying, but the inhabitants knew that the ice projectiles would not penetrate inside. This feeling of security in the face of the raging elements was priceless. To protect their animals, the settlers sometimes built small earthen sheds or shelters next to their homes. They wanted to save at least some of their livestock, because every cow and every horse was extremely valuable. But even such auxiliary structures rarely withstood the hailstorms. The dugout itself, however, always remained intact, and the family could wait out the storm, knowing that their home would withstand anything that fell from the sky. Steppe fires were another deadly enemy, moving at the speed of a train, devouring dry grass. Fire could destroy a wooden house in minutes, leaving only the chimney standing. The dugout, on the other hand, was completely fireproof on the outside. Earth does not burn. If the windows and doors were closed in time and the fire front passed, the house remained intact. Many frontier residents cleared the area around their dugouts of dry grass in advance to reduce the intensity of the fire near the walls. They had to be careful because the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. The flames sometimes came so close that the air in the house became heavy and smelled of burning, but the turf structure itself withstood even the most violent flames. People knew that nothing threatened them underground, and this gave them confidence in the face of an unstoppable force of nature. However, this invulnerability had a downside. During floods, the dugout became a trap. If the house was built in a low-lying area or in the bed of a dry stream, a sudden flood could inundate it in minutes. The water quickly washed away the earthen walls, turning the dwelling into a muddy mess. Many had to leave their homes in a hurry, escaping the rising water on the roof. Some families built small earthen embankments or ditches next to their dugouts to divert the flow. This helped in normal seasons, but sometimes nature proved stronger than any human efforts. Spring ice drifts or prolonged rains could raise the water level so high that the earth let moisture in. The settlers understood that if they heard the roar of approaching water, they had to run upstairs and save their most valuable possessions. The dugout could protect against many misfortunes, but it was no match for flooding. The extreme temperature fluctuations characteristic of the continental climate were also no match for the sod walls. They smoothed out daily fluctuations when it was hot during the day and freezing at night. This allowed the body to conserve energy, as it did not have to constantly adapt to changes. The dugout was an inert system that ignored the vagaries of the weather. The settlers quickly realized that it was easier to maintain a normal rhythm of life in such a house. If outside the earth cracked from the heat or was covered with frost from a sudden cold snap, inside everything remained almost unchanged. This stable space became the only place where a person felt in control of the situation. And for this, many were willing to struggle with dirt and dampness every day. The feeling of security grew stronger with each storm that passed. People began to trust their earthen fortresses more than the flimsy structures of civilization. This shaped the unique mentality of the frontier dwellers. The confidence that if you stand firmly on the ground, or even in the ground, nothing can break you. This confidence was passed on to children who grew up in such houses and perceived them as a natural part of life. For them, a dugout was not something primitive. On the contrary, it seemed like a reliable and warm space where the family gathered in the evenings. And although over time many moved to more modern houses, their respect for the old burrows remained with them forever. Even earthquakes, although rare in this region, caused less damage to such flexible and low structures. The turf cushioned the tremors, and the walls settled rather than cracked or collapsed. It was architecture created by the logic of survival rather than aesthetics. Nature constantly tested the settlers' resilience, but their earthen houses took the brunt of the blow. It was a symbiosis of man and soil against wind and fire. Would you feel safer in a stone house or under a thick layer of earth during a hurricane? But surviving a storm is only half the battle. You also had to keep your sanity in the daily struggle with mud. In the next chapter, you will learn how housewives tried to create comfort in a mud house. Frontier women were not willing to accept that their homes resembled animal dens. They waged an endless and seemingly hopeless war against the grayness and dirt of earthen walls. The main weapon in this struggle was lime, which was applied directly to the earthen walls. The white color not only disinfected the surfaces, but, more importantly, made the room brighter by reflecting the scarce rays of sunlight. Whitewashing earthen walls was no easy task, as lime did not adhere well to crumbling soil. Various tricks had to be devised, such as reinforcing the surface with rods or mesh before applying the solution. Each layer of whitewash was a small victory of civilization over wild nature. The white walls psychologically separated human space from the surrounding environment. The most inventive discovery was the use of muslin, a thin, inexpensive fabric, to create ceilings. The fabric was stretched under the roof itself, secured around the perimeter of the walls to create a barrier between the living area and the crumbling earth. This improvised stretch ceiling caught falling dirt, dust, and small debris. Over time, the fabric sagged under the weight of the accumulated debris and had to be removed, shaken out, washed, and hung back up. It was hard and dirty work, but it allowed people to see something light and clean above their heads instead of black roots and branches. The white ceiling made the room appear taller and more spacious, saving us from bouts of claustrophobia. Pots of flowers were placed on the windowsills, no matter how narrow they were. Geraniums were the most popular plant, their bright flowers contrasting with the monochrome world of the prairie. These flowers were a symbol of hope and a reminder of the gardens left behind in the East. Caring for them was a ritual of maintaining normality in abnormal conditions. The floor in a dugout was most often left earthen, but it was tamped down to the hardness of stone. Housewives sprinkled it with fresh sand, or even tried to paint it if they could get paint. In the wealthiest families, boards were laid on the ground, which was considered the height of luxury and comfort. A wooden floor immediately raised the status of the house to a new level. Furniture was often made from the same materials as the house, or boxes and barrels were used, but every surface was covered with an embroidered napkin or tablecloth. Textiles were the main tool for creating comfort, softening rough shapes and adding color to the interior. Patchwork quilts, sewn from scraps of old clothes, were bright spots in the dim light of the dugout. The walls were decorated with clippings from newspapers and magazines, creating a kind of wallpaper. This not only covered the crumbling earth, but also provided food for thought and entertainment. Reading the walls became a common pastime for children and guests. The images of beautiful life from magazines were a window into another world. Partitions inside the house were made of fabric or blankets, dividing the space into zones. This created the illusion of privacy, although sounds freely penetrated such walls. Every square inch of space was tried to be refined and adapted for living. This battle for cleanliness and beauty was no less heroic than the plowing of virgin soil by men. Women turned dirty dens into real homes where children could be raised and guests could be welcomed. Their efforts proved that a home is not walls, but an atmosphere created by love and care. The only source of connection with the outside world in a dugout was its facade, the front wall that was not buried in the ground. This is where the door and window were located, and it was this side that received the most attention during construction. The orientation of the facade to the south or southeast was not a whim, but a strict rule of survival. In winter, the low sun shone deep into the room, providing light and warmth, and in summer, the high sun illuminated only the threshold without overheating the room. The door was the most expensive element of the house, often the only thing made by a professional carpenter. It was cherished, reinforced, and locked with a powerful bolt, although there was no one to steal from on the prairie. A sturdy door was a symbol of the boundary between the safe inner world and the hostile outside environment. Opening the door in the morning meant accepting the challenge of a new day. A window in a sod house was a real luxury, and its presence spoke of the owner's wealth. Glass was in short supply and was brought from far away, carefully packed so as not to break in the bumpy wagon. If there was no glass, the opening was covered with oiled paper or a cow's bladder, which let in light but did not provide a view. The windowsills were made very wide due to the thickness of the walls, turning them into additional shelves or benches. This was a favorite place for children, who could sit for hours and look at the endless steppe. Through this small opening, the inhabitants watched the weather, the approach of guests, or danger. Ventilation was mainly through the door and window, which created drafts. To ventilate the room, it was necessary to open both, creating a tube for the airflow. In winter, this was done very quickly so as not to cool the house. Often, a small canopy or vestibule was built in front of the entrance out of branches and turf. This space served as a gateway, keeping out cold air and dirt from the street. Tools, firewood, and outerwear were stored here. The vestibule was a transitional zone, a buffer between the wild nature and the home. Over time, when the family had the means, they tried to cover the front wall with boards or even lay it out with stone. This immediately changed the appearance of the dugout, giving it a more civilized look. Combined houses, half in the ground and half made of wood, were the next stage in the evolution of housing. They tried to make the windows so that they could be closed with shutters from the outside. The shutters protected the fragile glass from hail and wind during storms. The sound of the wind hitting the shutters was a familiar lullaby for frontier children. It was through these openings that the smells of the prairie in bloom in spring and the smoke of fires penetrated the house. The window was the eyes of the house, and the door was its mouth. Without them, the dugout would have been nothing more than a grave. The construction of the openings required the installation of strong lintels to prevent the heavy wall from crushing the frame. This was a weak point in the structure, where cracks often appeared and earth crumbled away. Repairing and reinforcing the openings was a constant concern for the owner. It is important to distinguish between two types of earthen houses that are often confused: the classic dugout and the sod house, or soddy. A dugout is essentially a burrow dug into a hillside, where the earth forms three walls, a floor, and a ceiling. It was the first, fastest, and most primitive type of dwelling that was built immediately upon arrival. It required a minimum of materials but was dark, damp, and cramped. A sod house, soddy, is a full-fledged above-ground structure where all four walls are made of cut sod bricks. Soddies were built later, when families had the time and energy to prepare thousands of earthen blocks. It was a step up the ladder of comfort and status. In a soddy, it was possible to make normal windows on different sides, providing cross-ventilation and better lighting. The walls were smoother, the ceilings higher, and the area larger. In such a house, it was already possible to separate rooms with partitions. However, the soddy lost some of the advantages of geothermal heating because it was not completely buried in the ground. The walls still retained heat better than wood, but they froze faster than the thickness of the hill. Therefore, the soddy required more fuel for heating in winter. On the other hand, the soddy did not suffer as much from groundwater and dampness coming from deep within the hill. The floor was drier and the air was cleaner. The risk of the roof collapsing remained, but walls built correctly could stand for decades. Some of these houses still stand today as monuments to an era. Moving from a dugout to a sod house was a big celebration for the family. It meant that they had settled on the land, survived the most difficult period, and were beginning to build a future. The old dugout was often left as a cellar, a tool shed, or a tornado shelter. Building a sod house required more skill and teamwork. Neighbors often got together to help lift the heavy roof or cut the sod. This strengthened social ties in the community, turning scattered settlers into a society. Nevertheless, both types of dwellings shared a common philosophy, using what was at hand. Both were an organic part of the landscape, growing out of it and returning to it after destruction. It was the most environmentally friendly architecture in American history. The difference between them was not only in construction, but also in psychology. A dugout is a shelter, a refuge. A soddy is a home, a claim to rights over this land. It is an evolution from survival to life. Gradually, with the development of railroads, even sod houses became a sign of poverty. People sought to build frame houses to be like everyone else. But many frontier veterans nostalgically remembered the coolness and quiet of their old earthen walls.
Finally, we can finish the schoolhouse.
With the arrival of railroads on the Great Plains, the era of earthen architecture began to rapidly fade into the past. Trains brought cheap wood, coal, brick, and glass. Now settlers no longer needed to dig into the ground to survive. Frame houses became a symbol of progress, prosperity, and civilization, which people so desperately sought. Dugouts and sod houses came to be seen as relics of a dark past, a shameful reminder of poverty and deprivation. They were abandoned, used as cattle pens, or simply plowed under, returning the earth to the earth. The prairie quickly healed its scars, and within a couple of years, only a small mound remained where the house had stood. However, this experience did not pass without a trace. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the economy collapsed and thousands of people were left homeless, the old knowledge came in handy again. Dugouts and sod shelters reappeared in camps for the homeless and workers. People remembered that the earth could provide warmth for free when there was no money for coal or rent. Earth construction techniques also found their way into military applications. The dugouts and earthen shelters of World War II were built on the same principles as the pioneer houses. Protection, heat retention, and simplicity were qualities that were as highly valued on the front lines as they were on the frontier. Today, we are seeing a resurgence of interest in underground houses and earth-based technologies as part of green building. Eco-architects are studying the experience of the pioneers to create energy-efficient houses that do not require air conditioning or powerful heating. The frontier's underground trick turned out to be not a primitive craft, but a brilliant, intuitive solution. The legacy of dugouts has remained in culture. Stories about life in burrows were passed down from generation to generation, forming family legends. Photographs of families against the backdrop of soled walls are some of the most recognizable images in American history. We must remember that the development of a huge part of the continent was only possible thanks to this modest architecture. Without dugouts, America would have stopped at the edge of the forest. The earth gave people not only food, but also shelter. This period of history teaches us that comfort is a relative concept. For a person freezing in the steppe, a dark, damp burrow with a temperature of plus 112 degrees was paradise. Human ingenuity can turn the most unfavorable conditions into a resource for survival. Earth houses have disappeared from the face of the earth, but they remain in its memory. They became the foundation on which modern agrarian America was built. It was an architecture of hope, grown from grass and mud. The next time you turn on the thermostat in your home, remember those who warm themselves with the heat of the planet itself. Their experience proves that the most complex problems sometimes have the simplest solutions, lying right at our feet. The history of dugouts and sod houses is not just a story about old construction methods. It is a lesson in the incredible adaptability of humans, who are capable of finding shelter even where nature seems to have left them no chance. The underground trick of using the Earth's heat made it possible to turn a lifeless desert into a home for millions of people. They paid for it with their comfort, health, and titanic labor, but they defeated the cold. Do you think modern construction technologies could protect people in the wild steppe without electricity as effectively and cheaply as simple dugouts did? Share your opinion in the comments, suggest topics you would be interested in learning about in future episodes, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.